Reactive training systems.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on when you are watching this video. I hope you enjoy it anyway. We're going to be talking about some of the questions that came in on Instagram a few weeks ago, following up from 2 weeks ago. We're going to talk a little bit about high frequency training, injury, and pivot blocks, and a little bit about developmental blocks. So the first question is how to implement a higher frequency training from a more classic training split. Now, I imagine essentially what this means is that you've been training upper lower, so maybe 2x frequency, or potentially even you're only training each exercise once a week. Maybe something like 5-3-1, where you have a squat day, bench press day, deadlift day, overhead press day, and then some accessory movements after that. It's hard to tell exactly where you're coming from with this question, but I'll assume it's something like that. And usually when people are starting with me and I'm trying to get them to implement higher frequency training, essentially what I want to do is slowly introduce new stimuli to their training to see if they can adapt properly. The reason is, if you start with 1 time a week programming, so you have one exposure to a given stimulus every week. That's legs, one leg stimulus per week, maybe one quad stimulus per week, one hamstring stimuli per week, one exposure to chest stimulation essentially per week. If you're adding more stimulation, sometimes you can push it too far, and the result is that maybe you have an overuse injury, or you not overtrained probably, unless you're really pushing yourself, but you're overreaching a little bit quickly because you're simply not capable of adapting so quickly to the changing stimuli. So if someone is starting with me and they want to, or I feel that maybe they even need to improve their frequency because that might help with their strength gain, we start slow. So I'll add one exposure additionally to what they've been doing before per week. So maybe we'll do one developmental block with an extra one added exposure, and we'll see what happens. If the additional going from 1x frequency to 2x frequency, if that improves their strength, then great. We might even stick with that for a while until that stops working. We might use frequency in a different context when it comes to emerging strategies. Usually when we talk about frequency, we're talking about the competition lift itself. So competition squat, comp bench, and competition deadlift. But in this context, we're just talking about frequency in terms of like upper body and lower body. So anyway, the answer is add one exposure to a given block. See what happens. Add an additional exposure to a different to your next block and see what happens. So if you're used to doing upper lower, 4-day upper lower split, but you want to do 3-day full body, that's a really good transition. That about adds one exposure to the upper body and one exposure to the lower body each week. And if you respond well to that, then it's a good chance you should continue doing it. And there's not usually a reason to change things if they are working, unless you just want to continue to experiment, which can kind of turn you into somewhat of a program hopper if you're always testing ideas. But that can be fun for some people, and as long as you're taking notes on what works and what isn't, then you should be okay. The next question is it possible to see different progress patterns for different exercises during a developmental block? I think what this question is asking is, can the squat progress at a different rate as the bench press, at a different rate as the deadlift? And the answer is yes, but typically the progress it maybe varies by 1 week or even half a week, and at that point you kind of want to average the peaks of the squat, bench, and deadlift. So if your squat and bench peak in 7, but your deadlift peaks in 6, then it might be beneficial to plan for peaking in 6, and that way everything at least is on the upward pattern, versus if you wait till week 7 and the deadlift is already dropped, then you're missing out on the deadlift performance. But Usually that means you just need to adjust the actual stimuli throughout the developmental block so that they're peaking at a bit of a more even rate. So perhaps the deadlift can't sustain 7 weeks of peaking or of progress, but the squat and bench press can. Well, you have to ask, why might that occur? If that's happening because you just don't tolerate the deadlift stimuli that you're giving yourself. So if you have 27 units of deadlift stress but 21 units of squat stress, well, that might be the reason why they're peaking at different times. So it's important to look at what exactly is the reason for the difference in peak, and the answer is yes, they can change. They can peak at different times, but maybe don't end it there. If they start peaking at different times, look into maybe reducing the stressor, the stress of the deadlift or the squat or the bench press, whichever movement is peaking early, so that it can sustain a little bit longer progress. And that's something you really just have to trial and error. How do you go about determining how to structure a pivot block per the individual? We actually have a podcast on developing pivot blocks that we did with the whole staff. I think it was 2 weeks ago that we released it. You can look at it there. But if you haven't seen that, you want a quicker answer, really you just you see what happens. So let's say a rule of thumb is that we want 1/3 of the developmental block length to be how long a pivot block is. So if your developmental block is 6 weeks, then your pivot block will be 2 weeks. It's 1/3. 2 times 3 is 6. So you'll try a 2-week pivot block, 6-week developmental block. If the start of the next developmental block after the pivot block is, let's say, you see that your strength decreases 5%, that's usually within the range of what we're expecting at the start of the next developmental block, is a 5% drop from the top of the peak of the last developmental block. If you're experiencing even more of a strength loss than that, perhaps you're pushing too long, or perhaps you still have a 2-week pivot block, but the pivot block has a bit more stress. So maybe a bit more specificity, a bit higher intensities, a bit more frequency throughout the week. So you're not just training 2 or 3 times a week, maybe you're sticking to 4 times, but the overall stress is lower. Obviously, it's kind of a wait and see. You have to trial some of the options out and see what happens. I've had some lifters, most lifters actually respond pretty well to the standard 1/3 frequency for pivot blocks. And if they're not responding, I usually keep the amount of weeks the same, but I'll up the stress just a little bit. Maybe I'll move the specificity of the exercises up, increase the specificity, and potentially increase the intensity a little bit. Another question is, at what point do you recommend introducing autoregulation to a beginner or intermediate client? Now, personally, I think you should do this as quickly as you can. I think it's important for beginner lifters to understand that if you understand what autoregulation means, it's not necessarily about making training easier for you, but it is more about making training work for you on the given day. So if you're training in a situation where you're under high stress and you have a crazy job, if a beginner athlete understands that it's okay to have a decrease in performance during that time, then hopefully they'll be more adherent to their program. They'll have a better willingness to stick with everything. If they experience a performance drop, especially in a situation where they're under high levels of stress, or they're in a situation where they are performing really well and they want to keep doing it, but then maybe they hit a wall because their internal stress from the gym is increasing significantly, and at some point they need to wash out. So autoregulation allows for them to understand what's happening in their programming, and I think increasing their autonomy and understanding of why things are happening and allowing change to happen when it needs to is important. So if I'm working with a lower or a beginner athlete, a newer lower experience level athlete, I'll try to get them to understand auto-regulation as soon as possible. Whether we go fully RPE on everything or we just start introducing RPE, letting them know that they should try to create some self-awareness with each exercise. That's an important skill to develop. It's going to take time anyway, so why not introduce it when they first start? That's my take on that. Another question is the Bulldog Grip on the bench press an effective or optimal way to bench? I think Bulldog Grip is suicide grip, or perhaps, maybe I shouldn't have answered this question, but if the Bulldog Grip is a suicide grip, I don't know what would make that optimal. I don't know why. I think Bulldog Grip, you might be referring to kind of having the bar above the wrist and your fingers kind of clamping on it instead of grabbing around the bar. That's personally how I bench press. I don't necessarily think everyone needs to bench press like that, or it's particularly optimal. I think what's going to be optimal for you is a bench press grip that allows for long-term sustainability. So if this grip feels really uncomfortable on your wrist, the Bulldog Grip is really uncomfortable on your wrist, and at some point you start experiencing pain or irritation or inflammation, maybe you need to change a different grip or go wider or go narrower. I don't think there is an optimal grip for bench press. However, if you are benching and your wrist looks like this and the barbell is somewhere around, here, right? If the barbell's here and you're pressing up with your elbow, well then you have about 3 inches of a lever arm that you're creating. What that means is you're making it more difficult for you to directly apply force to the barbell. So I always recommend to try to find a position that allows you to feel comfortable in getting the barbell as close to the top of the wrist as possible. So maybe it's a bit high, maybe it's more on the fleshy part of your thumb right here. Maybe it's a little bit closer to the bottom of your hand, but as long as it's pretty close to where you're applying force, if you can find a position where that's comfortable, I think you're going to be in a really good place. How much do you feel emotional output or intensity skews RPE? It's a good question. And I think that emotional output in terms of like hyping up, I think that's what the question is getting at. That's actually something that I've been discussing with a lot of my lifters, because I have some lifters who are pretty low, they're very intrinsically motivated, and they don't express themselves audibly as much when they're lifting, so maybe they're not yelling or screaming, but they're really nervous or they're really excited internally, and they get quiet, they kind of shut down, but that's their way of experiencing that same level of emotional output. It's just being kind of stored inside of them instead of letting it out or expressing it outwardly. How does that skew the RPE? I think what's important is to figure out what you can do that's repeatable. Can you repeat the level of can you repeat that external output for your top set, down set, next exercise, next session? Because if you can't repeat the energy if you can't regain that energy for every single set, then it might be too much to do if it's taking away from all the volume and the magnitude of the intensity. So when we're talking about volume, we're trying to magnify the intent of the session. So if you're not getting to your volume work because you're arousing yourself too much for that top set, that's going to put you in a difficult position because you don't have any energy left to use it all in the top set. Your RPE was probably accurate, but your RPE was also based on the fact that your arousal level was up here. If your arousal level is here, then your RPE can be adjusted a little bit, or can be repeated, because if you are experiencing a certain level of arousal, then your RPE baseline is wherever that arousal level is. If you can't get to that arousal level every single time you lift, then it's going to be difficult to have some consistency with training. So typically if you have lower frequency training styles or lower frequency training programs, you have a lot more rest in between exercises and between training days, then I think you can get away with higher arousal levels in each training session, because you can recover from that increased intensity and increased stress that the higher arousal, higher RPE, and usually higher weights that you can lift. So if you can recover from all of that and then get back to the next session and do it again, and it's repeatable, then great. I don't think it skews RPE, but I do think the RPE intensity, the perception of your intensity is going to be adjusted based on the arousal level. So if you're not aroused and you're lifting something really heavy, and by arousal I mean like preparedness, ready for lifting. If your arousal level is really low, then it might feel really difficult to do some of your warm-ups. If you bring your arousal level up a little bit more, then you can get prepared for the top set. If you push it to like competition arousal level where your anxiety is crazy high and you've never performed a lift before, then if you can repeat that, go ahead. If you can't repeat it, maybe it's a good idea to bring it down. This is something I'm still kind of debating about with myself and with my clients, but I think that's a pretty good answer for what I have to say. Now I've talked enough. I hope this Q&A was helpful. Hopefully you guys can send some more questions in. I think they're really helpful. We're going to get some of the other coaches to join in on these, and I will see you next time.
Reactive training systems.